All right, welcome back everyone. We are now starting Unit 4. This is our last unit of the semester. So we have a few chapters packed into this unit, but it's really all going to tie in very, very nicely. And it will take us into our fourth exam, and that is the last of our regular exams. After that, all we will have is the final exam in lecture. So let's go ahead and get this unit started with our first lecture of Chapter 11, where we are going to be looking at nervous tissue or nervous fundamentals. In this chapter, we're going to introduce how the nervous system works. We're going to look at how the building blocks of the nervous system actually function to communicate. And then later in the semester, we are going to come back and look at some of the structures of the nervous system. So let's go ahead and get started with our not really attendance questions. What are the two electrically conductive systems of the body? And what is the integration center of most homeostatic feedback loops? Go ahead and pause your video, try to answer these questions. And hopefully you've done that, so let's take a look to see what the answer to these actually is. First, what are the two electrically conductive systems of the body? We talked about this back in Chapter 4 when we were looking at the different tissues. We are talking about the nervous system and the muscular system. So the rest of this semester, so all of Unit 4, is really going to be talking about these two systems. Specifically, we are going to get into this, the how electric is applied here. We're going to look at how electricity is generated, how it is conducted, and what's the point. Why do we want electricity traveling through our bodies in these systems? Next, what is the integration system or center of most homeostatic feedback loops? And most of the time, it's the brain. Not always, but usually it's the brain. So that part, all the way back in the very first lecture of the semester, when we talked about homeostatic feedback loops and homeostasis in general, now we're coming back to that again in this chapter and in this unit. So here's kind of a modified version of that diagram that we saw back on the first day of class. Remember, we said that there was a stimulus that traveled along the afferent pathway to the integration center, made a decision of what to do, and then sent some sort of signal through the efferent pathway to an effector. All right, so that's what we're looking at here. But now we're going to get a little bit more specific, and we're going to talk about the sensory input and the motor output. So sensory, we are taking the stimulus towards our central nervous system along the afferent pathway. Remember, A for arriving at the central nervous system, E for exiting the central nervous system. So the afferent pathway is carrying sensory information. If we see something, that visual information travels along the sensory afferent pathway. If we touch something and it's hot, or it's rough, or it's cold, that sensory information from our skin and the nerve endings there travels along the sensory afferent pathway. If we hear something, if we smell something, if we taste something, all of that is traveling along this sensory input. But now there are other senses as well. When we talk about the senses, usually we're talking about the special senses, but there are other senses. Our sense of balance, our sense of proprioception, which we'll talk about later this semester, heat and cold, that kind of thing. All of that travels along the sensory pathway, the afferent pathway. And at that point, it doesn't really mean anything. It's just an electrical signal traveling to the central nervous system. In this instance, it's traveling to the brain. The brain Usually, sometimes the spine if it's a reflex arc, but we're going to talk about the brain. When that electrical signal from whatever sensory input it is, when it gets to our brain gives meaning to it. It compares that sensation information to previous experience. What is that I'm seeing? What is that I'm hearing? What is that I'm touching? Kind of reminds me of, and then it kind of gives it meaning. This is when meaning is given to that information that arrived. It decides what do we need to do with that information, and then it sends some sort of electrical signal to a muscle in your body somewhere, usually. It's not necessarily always a muscle, but usually it is. So it sends a signal out through that motor efferent pathway so that we can have some sort of response. Here, I guess this person was thirsty. They saw some water. That information is sent to the brain. The brain interprets that information as, hey, that's a glass of water. Since you're thirsty, you might want to get a drink. And it sends signals through the efferent pathway, causing you to pick that glass of water up and take a drink. So now here we are looking at the different divisions of the nervous system, and there's a lot of divisions. I like to say it's kind of like those Russian nesting dolls. Each time you get to a new division, that new division has deeper divisions underneath it. So at the biggest level, we have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Now normally we will see CNS for the central nervous system. And over here, we see PNS for the peripheral nervous system. Let's not use PNS for peripheral nervous system. We'll see why in just a minute. CNS, central nervous system, or peripheral nervous system. Let's not use PNS for that. The central nervous system is our brain and our spinal cord. This is where we have that integration center that we talked about. The peripheral nervous system is all of the nerves coming off of the brain or spine, and they run through our entire body. The peripheral nervous system is both, if we go back to this picture, the sensory pathway, the afferent pathway, and the motor pathway, the efferent pathway. We have nerves that send signals towards our brain and spine. We have nerves that send signals away from our brain and spine, but both of them are a part of the peripheral nervous system. But if we look at the peripheral nervous system, there are two divisions. If we look at those different nerves, there are two divisions. There's that sensory afferent, the incoming, and the motor efferent, the outgoing. Both of those are divisions of the peripheral nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system is only one of two parts of the nervous system as a whole, along with the central nervous system. So peripheral nervous system was divided into the sensory afferent division and the motor efferent division. But the motor efferent division is broken down into two groups. There's the somatic nervous system. Somatic means voluntary or body related. So the somatic nervous system is the voluntary part of your nervous system. This is what sends signals to your muscles so that you can intentionally grab that glass of ice water, or you can intentionally type out a sentence, or you can intentionally walk down the hallway. That is the somatic nervous system. Voluntary, intentional movements. The other division of the motor nervous system is the autonomic nervous system, or the ANS. The autonomic nervous system, it's still part of the motor division, but here we are talking about involuntary things. These are usually things that are there to keep you alive. So the autonomic nervous system is stuff that we typically don't have to think about, So moving stuff through your digestive tract, going to use the restroom, changing your blood pressure. So things that are not voluntary, things that are pretty much there to keep you alive. And the autonomic nervous system is broken down into two divisions. The sympathetic nervous system, SNS, and the parasympathetic nervous system, PNS. That's why I said let's not call the peripheral nervous system the PNS, because usually when we hear the letters PNS, we are talking parasympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic and the parasympathetic are the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. We will spend an entire lecture talking about these two divisions at the very end of the semester. Right now, we're just going to talk about the basics. What are they? The sympathetic nervous system, the SNS, is our fight or flight response. This takes over when there is some sort of stress, be it something like fear, anxiety, but also something like if your body temperature gets too low, or if you are needing to fight for your life, or if you're exercising, something like that. Sympathetic nervous system, your fight or flight response. Parasympathetic nervous system, the PNS, this is the part of your autonomic nervous system that we sum up with rest and digest, relax and reproduce. When you are sitting at home watching TV, relaxed, munching on a bag of chips, your parasympathetic nervous system is in control. So parasympathetic nervous system and sympathetic nervous system are a little weird in that one of them is always active and the other is always inactive, and then they switch places. If the sympathetic nervous system is up, the parasympathetic nervous system is down. Or if the parasympathetic nervous system is up, the sympathetic nervous system is down. As one turns on, the other turns off. If you are at home, relaxed in the evening, watching TV, munching chips, your parasympathetic nervous system is in control. It does things like slows your breathing rate, lowers your blood pressure, digests the food that you're eating. But then if someone kicks in your door and starts yelling at you and holding a gun at you and you're terrified, your blood pressure spikes, you start to panic. You're either going to run out of your house to save your life or you're going to fight that person to save your life. That is your sympathetic nervous system in control. So one of these will be on while the other is off. Now going back the other way, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic are the two branches of autonomic. The autonomic and the somatic are the two branches of motor. The motor and sensory are the two branches of peripheral, and the peripheral and the central make up the nervous system. And that's what we will be talking about most of the rest of the semester. Now, there is a section in your textbook that talk about the neuroglia. There are a lot of cells in your nervous system. What we are going to devote our time to are the cells called neurons. We're going to see how neurons function. But there are many other cells actually that outnumber the neurons called neuroglia. There's different types of neuroglia. They are listed in your outline, and you are responsible for knowing the functions of those various neuroglia. We're just not going to devote time to it because neurons are going to take up a significant amount of time in our lecture. So what are neurons? Neurons are the structural unit of the nervous system. They are the electrically conductive cells that communicate throughout our body. And we will see that these neurons are highly specialized. So what are the special characteristics of neurons? Well, one, we say they have extreme longevity. That means that they live for a really long time. In almost all instances, neurons live as long as you do. You are born with the neurons that you die with very few exceptions. And neurons are amitotic. Think about what that might mean for a moment. See if you can break that word down and figure out what it means. Well, mito or mitotic kind of sounds like mitosis. A means not or against. So neurons are amitotic, meaning they do not go through mitosis. There is no cell division. And that's important. That's why they are so long-lived. Because if a neuron dies, it's not going to get replaced through cell division. They are amitotic. That's also one of the reasons, and we'll get into this more detail later, why if someone has something like a severe break in their back or neck, if it damages their spine and they become paralyzed, chances are they're going to be paralyzed forever. Now, there are some ways around that, which we'll talk about in another lecture, but as a general rule, neurons are amitotic. They are also highly metabolic, meaning they use a lot of ATP. And we're going to see why they use a lot of ATP in the second lecture of this chapter. So here is the structure of a neuron. This cartoon image is just an artist's rendition, and usually when you see it, it has a whole bunch of short branches and then one really long branch. And that's just to differentiate between this long thing and all of these short things. Up here in the top right, this is a real neuron, and it would be pretty tough to figure out which ones of these are the short ones and which one is the long one. So even though this is what you usually see in textbooks, keep in mind that it doesn't really look quite so neat. So when we look at a neuron, it will have branches. Sometimes there's a whole lot, sometimes there's just a few, but there will be branches. But right here, this part is called the soma, or the cell body. Sometimes you might hear it called the perikaryon. I'll tell you what that means in just a moment, but first let's talk about what is the soma. Well, back in chapter 3, when we were learning about the cell, we learned about the mitochondria and the nucleus and the Golgi body, all those different parts. Well, in a neuron, this, the soma, is that typical cell. This is where all those organelles are found. And right in the middle, there's our nucleus. We have a nucleolus right there. So, nucleus, sometimes you will see books refer to it as the karyon. K-A-R-Y-O-N. That means kernel. And the area around it is called the perikaryon. Peri means around. So the area around the nucleus is the cell body, the soma. Now, in the soma, we find all of those organelles that we learned about back in chapter 3. But something we're going to see when we talk about neurons, and again when we get to muscles, we're going to see even though they have the same organelles, sometimes we like to give them different names in these specialized cells. So sometimes you will see something called Nissl bodies or chromatophilic substance. Nissl bodies and chromatophilic substance are the endoplasmic reticulum, the rough ER. Now, here we're going to get to another kind of tricky term. Remember, a nucleus is where the DNA is found. And if you have one, it's called a nucleus. If you have more than one, they are called nuclei. Now, we're going to see that the word nucleus or nuclei will have more than one meaning. We've already seen that the center of an atom was called the nucleus. Here, a part of the cell is called the nucleus. And now we're going to add a third definition. Neurons like to cluster together. In the central nervous system, if we have a cluster of neurons, the cluster of cell bodies in the central nervous system is called a nucleus. There are various nuclei in the central nervous system. So when we're talking central nervous system, a nucleus is a cluster of neuron cell bodies. And in the peripheral nervous system, you might find the exact same thing. Clusters of cell bodies. But in the peripheral nervous system, we decided to give them a different name. They are called ganglia. One is a ganglion. More than one, they are ganglia. But ganglia and nuclei are clusters of cell bodies from neurons. If it's in the central nervous system, it's a nucleus. If it's in the peripheral nervous system, it's a ganglion. Now, if we have these clusters of cell bodies, we will also have these clusters of long branches. So let's look at what these branches are. Collectively, we call them processes, just things sticking off of the cell body. The shorter ones in this drawing, the ones that are really highly branched, these are the receptive parts of a neuron. We call them dendrites. Dendrites are the receptive part of a neuron. They carry electrical signals towards the cell body. Dendrites carry electrical signals towards the cell body. They are receptive. And then this neuron is going to send that electrical signal away from the cell body down this long process called an axon. Every now and then there may be a branch or two coming off of the axon. But normally, and especially in illustrations, we will see it just a long single branch. And then at the very end, it fans out. So this is the axon. The axon is the sending part of a neuron. The electrical signal comes in through the dendrites to the cell body, and then from the cell body it goes away along the axon. So we have these clusters of cell bodies called either a nucleus or a ganglion, depending on if it's central or peripheral. But we will also have clusters of axons. And again, depending on where in the body it is, we'll give them different names. A cluster of axons in the central nervous system is called a tract. A cluster of axons in the peripheral nervous system is called a nerve. So if we were to take a tract or a nerve, it's going to kind of look like a really, really thick cooked spaghetti noodle. And if we were to cut that open and look at it under a microscope, inside of that, we would see lots and lots of axons all running parallel to each other. Now, one thing that's important is those axons in that nerve will have either nuclei or ganglion at the end, depending on if it's originating in central or peripheral nervous system. So those are just some terms to keep in mind. Now let's go back to the axon, that long sending branch. The end that connects to the soma, you can see it's kind of funnel shaped. This is called the axon hillock. The axon hillock. For right now, we will say the axon hillock is the part of the neuron that determines if an electrical signal will be sent into the axon. We'll look at the how in the next lecture. But for right now, the axon hillock is the part of the neuron that determines if an electrical signal will be sent into the axon. If an electrical signal is sent into the axon, that electrical signal is going to travel down the length of the axon, and then it's going to get to these little fanned out branches at the end called the axon terminal. The axon terminal. And at the end of the axon terminal, there are these little swollen areas called terminal boutons. We will talk more about those in the third lecture of this chapter. And by the way, we will talk about these little blue things that are wrapping the axon when we get to the second or the third lecture. For right now, these are just called Schwann cells, and collectively they are called the myelin sheath. Okay, so let's take a little sidetrack and talk about some disorders involving the central nervous system. Now, there are a lot, but right now we're just going to talk about a couple. First is something called hydrophobia. Hydrophobia is the real name for something that we often call rabies. Rabies is something that isn't really common in people, but it is very common in animals, and it can easily be transmitted from animals to people. And if it's caught in time, not a big deal. So let's see what happens when someone is bit by a rabid animal. Here we have some sort of angry fox, rat, dog thing, whatever it is. It has rabies, and it has just bit this guy on the ankle who seems to be a little bit amused. He's just kind of watching this thing bite his ankle. I don't know why. But when this animal bites, if he has rabies, there are going to be rabies virus in the saliva of this animal. And it just bit and punctured this man's skin. When that happens, those viruses in the saliva make it into this guy's body. And what happens is those viruses make their way into the muscle around the bite. And as they're there, they start to replicate. The viruses replicate in this guy's muscle, and eventually we're going to see that muscle and nerve, they're pretty much tied together. Those viruses make their way into those motor neurons, those nerves that are affecting the muscles. Well, remember, when we were talking about the motor neurons, we said they were afferent. So signals are going away from the brain, away from the spine, towards the muscles. Signals go in that direction. But the thing that viruses do, the rabies virus specifically, is they get into those motor neurons and they go the other direction. We say they move retrograde. They are moving away from the bite, away from the muscle, towards the central nervous system. They get to the spinal cord, and now they're moving up the spinal cord toward the brain. And this whole process from bite until those viruses get up into the brain takes about 2 weeks. During this time, if this guy decides maybe this bite that he's watching is kind of a bad idea, maybe he'll go get a rabies shot. And I've never had a rabies shot, but I understand rabies shots, it's a series of shots, and they are among the most painful shots you can get, I hear. They don't anymore, but they used to give them in the navel. But that part's gone, but I still hear that it's a terrible set of shots to get. But if he gets them, he's all good. But if he doesn't get them, and these viruses make it to the guy's brain before he gets a rabies shot, it is fatal. It is going to kill him. There is no cure for rabies. There is prevention. Get that vaccine before the viruses get to the brain. But once the viruses get to the brain, it's going to kill him, and there is no stopping it. Because what happens is when those viruses get to the brain, they start to go through mitosis. Well, not really mitosis since they're viruses, but they start to cause your cells to replicate them. And those viruses replicate a lot. And it causes something called encephalitis, which is like a swelling of the brain inside the head. It also causes your salivary glands to start to become very active, and it makes your throat very, very sore. You can't drink water, and your salivary glands keep producing saliva, but you're becoming dehydrated because you can't drink water. And your saliva gets very foamy, and that's where that foaming at the mouth idea comes from. Because your salivary glands keep producing saliva, but there's not much water there, so it's kind of a foam. And you can't drink water. It starts to become very painful. It drives you into a rage. This is one of the things that is very common among rabies. It causes people to become violent. It causes animals to behave weirdly. They're out during the daytime if they're nocturnal, or they're out during the nighttime if they're diurnal. At this point, there is no saving, and unfortunately, the guy will die. Now, another disorder associated with the nervous system is chickenpox. We tend to associate chickenpox with the skin because you get these little bumps on your skin and they're very itchy, but it's actually nerve endings in the skin, which is where those pox are popping up. It's a virus very similar to herpes virus. It's related to the herpes virus. And, when you get chickenpox as a child, when I was a child, there was no vaccine for chickenpox. Luckily, now children have a vaccine for chickenpox, and chickenpox is kind of going away. But if you get chickenpox as a child, it's about 2 weeks of just itchy. You're tired, but you don't feel sick usually. Sometimes you might have a headache, but you're just constantly itching. But it's not a big deal. The weird thing is that same thing, chickenpox, if you don't get it as a child and you don't get the vaccine, but you get chickenpox as an adult, it can be fatal. Children is not a big deal. Adults, it can be fatal. If you do get chickenpox as a child, that virus, the thing about viruses is once a virus is in you, it is in you forever. So once the chickenpox goes away, you're not going to get chickenpox anymore, unless it is a very, very mild case. But if you get a normal case of chickenpox, you're not going to get chickenpox again. But the longer it has been since you had chickenpox, so if you get chickenpox when you're, say, 6 or 7, and you live to be 70, well, the longer it goes since you had chickenpox, the more likely that virus is to be reactivated. And reactivation can come about because of certain steroid hormones, because of things like stress, because of certain medications. Whatever it is, certain things can trigger that virus to become reactive, and it doesn't cause chickenpox again. That same virus that caused chickenpox the first time causes something called shingles the second time. And shingles is a skin rash that feels like you are on fire. And it's usually around the trunk, but it can be on the arms or legs. And I've not had shingles. I did have chickenpox, but I've not had shingles. And what I understand, when someone has shingles, it hurts so bad that you can hardly even wear clothing. You can't sit or lie down so that something is touching the affected area. So there is also a shingles vaccine. So if you have had the chickenpox vaccine, or if you have had chickenpox and you are past the age of 50, you can get the shingles vaccine. So here's something interesting. I was looking for images of animals with rabies, and I found something much more interesting. So, how to identify an animal with rabies: aggressive behavior, we just talked about that. Muscle spasms, convulsions, anxiety and restlessness, hypersalivation, so foaming at the mouth. Those are all signs of rabies, which I was looking for a good photograph of a rabid animal, but like I said, I found something much more interesting, and that is how to distinguish the difference between someone with rabies and a zombie. Apparently, the only thing that is the same among a zombie and someone with, or an animal with rabies, is they are both aggressive. Everything else seems to be either or. So, if you ever need to know how to identify a zombie, there are your little key things to look for. All right, here's that myelin that we talked about just a little bit ago. Myelination. Some neurons have myelination, others do not. So what is myelination? Myelin, or the myelin sheath, is insulation. Think about if you have a wire and you are sending electricity through it. If it is an exposed wire versus another wire that has some sort of rubber insulation around it. Well, the one that has rubber insulation around it is going to carry that electricity better. Same thing with neurons. Some neurons have a myelin sheath that act as insulation, and the electrical signal can pass down that axon faster. So what is a myelin sheath? It is a living cell. In the central nervous system, they are wrapped in something called an oligodendrocyte. In the peripheral nervous system, they are wrapped in something called a Schwann cell. So really all it is just a cell that wraps itself around the axon, kind of like a cinnamon roll. It's just wrapped around and around and around, and here we can see these layers wrapped around and around and around this axon. Now, the reason we want that, like I said, is because we want to insulate and make it more efficient to send an electrical signal. So here's the axon, and here is one of those cells, a Schwann cell here, wrapped around it. And then we see some more exposed axon. If we go back to our earlier picture, here is one of those pieces of myelin sheath, here's another and another, and we can see these exposed axon in between. When we learn about how axons send electrical signals in our next lecture, we'll see that it is important to have these exposed areas. If the entire thing was wrapped, we could not send an electrical signal. But these exposed areas of the axon are called the nodes of Ranvier. The nodes of Ranvier. Nodes of Ranvier are exposed areas of axon between cells that make up the myelin sheath. So here's that cell wrapping the axon. Here is one node of Ranvier. Here is another node of Ranvier. There would be another Schwann cell down here. All right, so that brings us to the end of this first lecture for our nervous tissue lectures. Now, right now, all we've talked about really is just anatomy, the structure of the nervous system. Next, we will talk about how these cells actually generate electricity or pass electricity. It's a good idea, if you haven't already, go back and review chapter 3 when we were talking about the channels, the voltage gated channels, the sodium potassium pump, things like that, because that is going to be the foundation for our next lecture. All right? If you have any questions as you watch this, let me know. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. I think this is one of the more interesting chapters that we get into, so hopefully you do too once we get into it and you start seeing how our nervous system works. All right? Take care, and I will talk to you next time.